Hello, we'll come here at Genesis chapter 39 and we're going to see Joseph in Egypt. And through this chapter, we will see the divine hand of God and on this young man named Joseph. And God is a God of experiences, and He's not a figment of one's imagination. And He's real, He's eminent, he's immanent in world events, and you can explain away a man's belief, but you can never explain away his experiences, his or her experiences with God. And we will see here the divine hand of God in Joseph's life. And in verse 1 it says, "And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither." Now we see here this man is mentioned, Potiphar. Potiphar comes in and he says that Potiphar was a captain. He was a captain of Pharaoh's guard. He was an important man. And you see the God's hand here. And Joseph, he could have, met any person at the slave market. He could have met anybody at the slave market. But here he met Potiphar. And Potiphar bought Joseph. And again, it says in verse 2, it says, "And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian." And here he mentioned that the Lord was with Joseph, and Joseph is prosperous. And if you look at here, Joseph was a slave bought in the slave market, but here the Bible says that Joseph was prosperous and he had no wealth. There was no wealth that he had, nothing material, but God said he was prosperous. And what does that mean? Because him just being a slave doesn't have anything, doesn't own anything, but it speaks here about his remarkable ability. And his remarkable ability that God has his hand on him. And throughout, we have seen many, throughout the Genesis, we have seen people the Gentiles who have seen the hand of God in the lives of one of the patriarchs. For example, King Abimelech saw the hand of God in Abraham, also Isaac. King Abimelech saw, the hand of God in Isaac, his son, and wanted to make a covenant with them. Says, I seen your hand. Laban, Jacob's uncle, kept Jacob as a slave almost because he saw the hand of God in this man, the remarkable ability that God has bestowed upon the patriarchs. And then here you see Joseph dealing with Potiphar now. You see, all are witnessing the hand of God in their servants. You see, however, three of these patriarchs, if you notice, God appeared to them directly, but here it did not appear to Joseph. There's no place that says that God appeared to Joseph directly, like he did with the other three patriarchs, which is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why? Somebody might say because Jacob is now in the far country. He's now being sold to the slave in Egypt. So he's out of the country in Canaan. And however, the hand of God was more, you know, on Joseph than other patriarchs. We can see that later. So moving on, it says in verse 3, it says, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. Now Potiphar saw the hand of God. Again, he saw the hand of God in Joseph's life. Again, it speaks about his remarkable ability. And it says, and Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had, he put it in his hand. Now, this man found grace in the sight of Potiphar, and Potiphar promoted him to be an overseer. In other words, manager, to be a manager for all the things that this man possessed. And it says in verse 5, it says, and it came to pass from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. Now, it says that the Lord, he blessed the Egyptians, he blessed the Egyptian house simply, for Joseph's sake. And simply because of Joseph's presence, because Joseph was in the house with the Egyptians, and Joseph's presence, which the blessing which permeated, it permeated not just in the house, but also it permeated in the field. And this was the Abrahamic blessing, and it basically overshadows the entire household of Potiphar. And in verse 6 it says, and he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught what he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. Now it says that Potiphar left everything for Joseph to run because of Joseph's remarkable ability, and this man is having so much increase in his household, and he's prospering, and he's all Potiphar was doing was he was just sitting there and eating. But this man Joseph was in charge of everything concerning the affairs of Potiphar. And here it also speaks about the appeal of Joseph. It says that he was a goodly and well favored. In other words, he was a handsome man. He was an attractive man. And moreover, in verse 7, it says, and it came to pass after these things, speaking of what I just explained concerning his master's wife. Now you have a master's wife now comes to the picture here. It says, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. See, things now is starting to change. And with all these things that are going on, with all these blessings that is going, and Joseph being the overseer and taking in charge of Potiphar. Potiphar's household, now he introduces his wife. He says, and here she says, the wife started casting her eyes upon Joseph lustfully. And she started lusting on Joseph, and Joseph was a slave. And like all other slaves, this woman just wanted pleasure. She's not interested in, obviously, want to have Joseph for either any marriage or anything, but now this woman is lusting after Joseph for pleasure, for her own pleasure, and she comes and says, lie with me. And here, this begins the trouble in Joseph's life, the crisis that comes here, because this woman is not only domineering, but she's very persistent. And here in verse 8 it says, but he refused, and said unto his master's wife, behold, my master worried not what is with me in the house, and he had committed all that he had to my hand. Joseph refused. He said, the master My master, speaking of Potiphar, you know, he says he knows not about his inventory. I'm the one who taking care of all the inventory because I have control over all the inventory in the house. And he says, my master, Potiphar, had trusted me with everything. He has trusted me with everything. You see, and he continues on. He says in verse 9, he says, there is none greater in this house than I, neither had he kept back anything from me, but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? See, here it sums up all Joseph's character here. He does not want to sin against God. And this is a man that is a remarkable young man. And here is the main core of who Joseph is, because he is, not only does he have integrity, but also he respects God. He's God. And this is a man of integrity, but also he's a man that feared God, and with great awareness of God's plan and purpose of his life. And he has seen the hand of God in his life. This man is, he's the man that has reverence of who God is, the El Shaddai, you know, the God of Abraham, the one true living God. And this was the God Joseph refers to her, you see. And he says, Joseph, he did not fear Potiphar, he did not fear his wife, nor did he fear the Egyptians, but here he fears God. Joseph feared God Almighty. And, you know, Joseph, he could have been like anybody else, you see, except that he had a healthy fear of God. And when you have a fear of God, a healthy fear of God, everything aligned on its own. You see, this is the right motivation. This is the right motivation of a man's life, is to fear God. You see, and Joseph was not working for Potiphar; he was working for God. And certainly, things could have gone sour if he had committed the sin he had. You know, he was supposed to commit it, because in Proverbs, you know, 6, 9, no, excuse me, Proverbs 6 verses 29, he says, he that goeth into his neighbor's wife, whosoever toucheth her shall not be innocent. See, things could have gone bad for this man if he have uh, gone the way the temptation was going. You see, but here he feared God, and he aligned himself with God's purpose and God's plan, and he refused this woman's um, advances. And that's the perspective. You know, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. That's what his perspective was. He's aligning himself with his God's plan, purpose, and who God is. He was, you know, love God and respect God. So here in verse 10, it says, and it came to pass, see, because he refused her and mentioned God. He said, mentioned El Shaddai. He said, I will not sin against God. And continually, he says in verse 10, it says, and it came to pass as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. See, now it becomes a day by day issue, a day by day crisis now. And this woman is not going to stop. And this woman did not respect Joseph's God, and, you know, did not fear Joseph's God. You know, she was obviously an idolatrous woman. She was an Egyptian, and the Egyptians believe in many gods. See, here you see, and he knows nothing about the God of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. And she was becoming persistent here. And he says, you know, in verse 11, it says, and it came to pass about his time that Joseph went into the house to do his business. and there was none of the men of the house there within. Now this woman, she's seeing that Joseph was alone and nobody around Joseph, and now she's gonna seize this opportunity now, and she's gonna become very bold, and she's gonna go and force herself to Joseph. And it says in verse 12, and she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. Now she caught him by his garment now. It says, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. You see, now she's becoming forceful. And what happens? Joseph flee. He ran. He ran away from her. Then in verse 13 it says, and it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, see, he had brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. You see, she comes in, she holds the garment of Joseph, grabs him by the garment, and begins to force herself, and Joseph took off and ran. And now she holding on to this garment, and now she calls up her audience. She calls the men of the house, and he said that Potiphar brought in an Hebrew. So he brought in an Hebrew to mock them. First of all, this woman does not fear God, and she shows very little respect for her husband, or little to no respect for her husband. Even, he's undermining her husband's decision to bring in Joseph in front of the entire servants. And he said that, he's bringing this Hebrew. She's also a racist. She calls him a Hebrew by ethnicity. And he did not call him by his name. He didn't call him Joseph, but he has brought in this Hebrew. And then moving on, it says, and it came to pass when he said, and she continued on to frame you and says, and it came to pass when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. See, now she's twisting the story to frame Joseph. And he said that he came to lie with me forcefully. And, understand this, that a simple accusation by the woman, by the master's wife to a slave in those days, it means death. It's an imminent death. That means that Joseph, understand also that Joseph was a slave, you see, and a slave's life was cheap in those days, but Joseph was important to Potiphar, so she waited for Potiphar to come home and to explain to him, you see. And it says in verse 16, and it says, and she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. See, now she uses this garment for evidence and laid it next to her to wait for Potiphar to return home. And this was her proof in her attempts to frame Joseph. In verse 17 it says, and she spake unto him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. Now when Potiphar came home, she blames him now, say that, of bringing a Hebrew servant into the house, and now she gave her false report. She uses her words well to frame this innocent young man, Joseph. You see, and according to, this is a false report. She brings this false report, and if you look at Exodus concerning false report, it says in Exodus 23 verse 1. It said, "Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thy hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness." See, this woman is an unrighteous witness, and she's bringing false report and trying to smear this young man's reputation and destroy him, and trying to destroy his reputation. You see, and again, Joseph was a slave, and he had no one to defend him, no one to defend his reputation. There was no one to defend his saying, and he cannot stand in front of any judge or court because he cannot be. He's not able to do that as a slave. He does not have the rights or the power or anything. He's just a slave. He was easily disposable like any other slave, and he had no one except God. See, only God. But here it says in verse 19, it says, "And it came to pass and now she's continuing on with the Potiphar with the story. You know, this woman is now using maligning with the story, becoming, you know, trying to frame him. And here it says, "And it came to pass as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled." Now, the garment she's holding on is the evidence. You see, and Potiphar heard this story, and now Potiphar became angry with Joseph. You see, and he turned against him, and he's going to turn against him. Now, there are some who will, use their words to frame up a story very well, and this woman was that kind of person, to turn things in her favor. And it says in verse 19, "And it came to pass when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did the servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison." See, Potiphar became angry because she saw that. Obviously, she takes his wife's words, and but understand that Potiphar could have killed Joseph. It would have been easily for him, to just say, "Okay, kill him." But here he throws him. To throw him in prison was the hand of God. This was the hand of God moving in this young man's life and moving in Joseph's behalf. And God is promoting him, you see. But it seems here that he's being demoted from his place because he was the overseer of all this. But now he's been thrown in jail, and it seems like God is, it seems like he's being demoted. Sometimes God demotion in our lives sometimes looks contrary to the world system, you see. It almost looks as if, God is punishing him or God is punishing us when he's actually promoting us. And Joseph is a type of Christ. And in the Old Testament, sometimes God will allow evil. Sometimes God allows evil to happen to us as believers. God will sometimes allow things to happen to us, but so he can show and lead us, lead us to victory. And God always uses this type of method. But here it's time for Joseph to go somewhere else. God is releasing him from that place. And you see, Joseph's brothers mistreated him. And they mistreated him, they gossiped about him, they caused envy. They were envy, they attempted murder, and then they sold him to slavery. But here he comes in Potiphar's home. His wife lusted after him, framed him, and Potiphar angrily throws him into jail. See, this is injustice in this man's life, full of injustice that has happened to him. And he's only 17 at this time, or perhaps 18, a teenager, or could have been older, but in here he's now thrown in prison. But the prison is the king's, again, king's prison. And understand that they say that this is the king's prison. Now God is somehow moving him towards his destiny, but he's meeting the right connections. But in his eyes, or in someone's eyes, it might seem like God is punishing him. And then you're going to see two prominent people are going to enter into this prison and connect with Joseph, is the baker and the cupbearer, by divine connection. And this is Pharaoh's jail, you know. So in other words, it's an upgrade for a slave like Joseph. You know, you look at God's hand in motion, you know, being sold by his brothers and to the Ishmaelites, or the Moabites, and now to the Egyptians, to the house of Pharaoh, and then from the house of Pharaoh, he's going to, no, excuse me, from the house of, he's sold to the house of Potiphar, and now from the house of Potiphar, he is going to the house of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So this is God's hand of motion in this man's life. But here it seems like he has been thrown and cast into the jail cell, you see. Moving on, and it says in verse 21, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." See, it says, but the Lord was with Joseph in jail. See, God is with him. And if you look at it, he is slowly moving into Pharaoh's court. And you see, Joseph, he met Potiphar. And Potiphar was closer to Pharaoh. And then he put him in jail. And then instead, he put him in the king's jail. In the king's jail, you know, Joseph probably may have cried. Joseph may have blamed or something, or he would have been very sad. You know, just like when his brother sold him into slavery. You know, this is human emotion. He probably would have cried and wept. And, you know, let us not, you know, minimize or disregard the emotional part, the human emotion here, you see. And then, you know, we sometimes we negate the human emotion, but it is a painful thing being sold by a slave in slavery. It's a very painful thing, and especially by those of your own brothers, and the painful of being framed by your master's wife. You see, the person who you have served for a very long time and gave all, and then you know, your master came coming home, did not trust you, and just cast you into the jail, just like that. But pain and hurt is different, you see. You know, we have to experience pain, you see. We have to experience pain, because pain, you know, is part of life, you know. But internalizing hurt becomes bitterness. It's a human choice, see. Either we forgive and move on. But here, this man forgave and he moved on. You see, but Joseph leaned on God. He trusted God and he became optimistic, even in jail. And God gave him favor in the sight of the keeper. And God is the one that gives favor. Understand that God gives favor in the sight of man. And favor comes from God. If you read in Exodus, 3 verse 21, it says, "And I will give the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall come to pass that when you go, you shall not go empty." See, God is the one that gives favor. Favor comes from God. And, this is what God is saying to Moses later on, beforehand, before he sent them out. But God says, he will give favor. Favor comes from God. So stop, giving credit to man for promoting you. When we give credit to man, we take it away from God. God is the one who did it. God is the one who gives favor. When when they begin to mistreat you in a certain places, it's evident that God's favor is not there anymore. See, but God is the one that gave this man favor. And then it says here, and the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did, he was the doer of it. You see, the keeper of prison now again committed all things in Joseph's hand. And now God is training Joseph. You see, everything, you understand that throughout the time he's been in Egypt, God is training him. Even in his time, in the worst part, God is still training him for managerial skills, because he's going to use that later. This is a very important skills that God is training him now in the prison. And God will never promote you to a place that he hasn't trained you yet. You see, God sometimes put us under to teach us, to train us, to develop us. And sometimes when we look at positions, God elevates someone and we say, why me? Why not me? You know, but you don't know where God has taken that person. God can take that person to a worse place, even in jail. And now, as Joseph was in jail, see, it says in verse 23, and the keeper of prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. See, the keeper of the jail, you know, he just let Joseph, you know, be the manager. He did not need to be oversight on anything. He just, you know, or micromanage him. He just let Joseph, just like Potiphar did, he let Joseph basically run the whole place. And, you know, Joseph served God with the spirit of excellence. And God blessed him, see. And then now, the favor now is in the jailhouse. And Joseph needed to be in jail. See, he needed to be in jail, and because this was a divine appointment for him to be in jail, and that is where God wanted him to be. And you see, at Pharaoh's jailhouse, this is Pharaoh's jailhouse. He needed to be there, and in order to save his family. And now this is God's view. He needed to be here, and if Joseph would have been released, if he would have been released, he would have probably gone home, and the purpose of God will not be fulfilled in his life. But, you know, Israel is going to be hit with a worse famine, and it's going to happen in all over the world. And now God is going to use this young man, you see. But here, this is, you know, this man, this is where he is now, and God will use him to do great things. You know, categorically, if you look at God's hand, you know, Joseph could have been killed by his brother, and but sold to the Ishmaelites. His brothers could have killed him. His brothers could have just eliminated him, and you know, and while he was in the pit, because his brother's intention was to kill him. But now, throughout, God used the Ishmaelites to become a way of escape. And Joseph could have met anybody at the slave market in Egypt. He could have met anybody, could have picked him up. But Potiphar bought him, and, you know, again, he could have killed by his accusation. You see, when his wife framed him, Joseph could have easily been killed or put in prison. But here he was put in prison, rather not just any prison, but he was put in prison, in a king's prison, in Pharaoh's prison. And now later on, you could have met any other person, but he's going to meet the person who is direct servant to the king of Egypt. You see, it's better to examine the people around you that God has placed in your life and on your path. You know, sometimes some of them are there to propel you to your destiny. You see, in Romans 8 verses 28, it says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God and to them that are called according to his purpose. You know, when you're a child of God, even the good, the bad, the ugly, all are working in your favor, and that's God's hands. You know, see that the Lord Jesus Christ was nailed to the cross. It seemed like that would have been the end. And Satan thought that he was winning, but eventually God gained the victory. See, so God is using everything. You know, when something happens to a child of God, don't say that God is, punishing me in a way, or God is doing something. Of course, God will punish you, but again, if you do something bad. But if God is using, directing you and guiding you throughout, sometimes he will put you in a worse place, but it's all for your good. So we're going to begin again in Genesis chapter 40. And until then, precious saints, God bless.